Hi, and welcome to this first of the lecture on fashion and costume history and context. Throughout the course of the lecture programmes, we'll be concerned with looking at clothes, and in particular the way in which they speak and the language of clothes. It will entail looking into the history of clothes and analysing how they were designed, interpreted and consumed, both in a historical context and also in a contemporary context. We will be analysing them within social, political and cultural frameworks, drawing references from many different sources. The aim of the lecture is for you to develop your writing skills and research skills and to write various essays and assignments. It will also be about developing visual responses in a group presentation in term 2. So we start off with the premise that clothes can actually speak. They can tell us about the wearer, they can tell us about the designer, and they can tell us about the society and era in which they were consumed. A good example I have of this is Catherine Hamlet when confronted with Margaret Thatcher at the height of the Falkland War. She proclaimed on her T-shirt that 58% of people did not want Pershing, which was relating to the war. And this is a direct statement that her T-shirt was able to proclaim as well as her. So the assignments for this module are a 1,500 word essay, which is based around a specific question, a reflective log of the lectures, which you will write in the first term, which will gauge your responses to the lectures and what you've understood and your research, and will also in term 2 will culminate in a group presentation where you'll be working with other members of team to present your ideas about clothing. So the selected themes in this are history, social status, storytelling, subcultures and identity, to name a few. These are the main key themes that we'll be looking at clothes with under. So if we look first of all at history, within clothing and the development of clothing, the fashion cycle and technology is all of importance in the way it can change our thoughts towards clothing and how it is made. We also use history as well as inspiration for our design work, and this will culminate in an interest maybe in a particular era or a particular designer. So these you'll be allowed to sort of develop your interests in this area. Also looking at the modes of sort of manufacture, so how clothing is made and produced, and also how it's sort of consumed within both in a historical context and in a contemporary context. Underlying all of this will be the extraction of meanings and particularly sort of social codes that clothes may adhere to. As a key example of this, we can look at a particular movement such as Art Deco and see how many different disciplines take on board sort of stylistic changes and ideas of form through from architecture to illustration, textiles and product design. So we look first of all at stylistic change, and I think what's important with clothing is that they can sort of define a time, they can change the landscape in a way that architecture can also do. So I think what's interesting for me is this transition from a 1836 context to a 1970s context, and I suppose what's important, what's interesting is this piece in between. So how have we gone from this state to this state? Similarly with women's clothing, so from a state with very corseted formal attire to an image here of Vivienne Westwood in one of her ripped t-shirts, which seems quite a long way from the representation that we have on the left here. You can also see this within advertising. So an advert from 1952 advertising a pressure cooker to the very visual fashion media and fashion advertising we see here in a diesel advert. I think what's important here is to see the importance of the visual, the importance of the image replacing text. In this advert, it's very text heavy, and here we merely have a visual to represent the ideas. Similarly with textiles, we can see this move maybe from very loose, sort of floral, organic, natural shapes to very geometric forms. Likewise with product design. So cutlery here shown in very ornate form, very floral and decorated, to the very pared down, minimalistic, simplistic cutlery of the Bauhaus movement. So we'll go through some of those themes, and the first one being social status. So this idea that clothing can communicate something about our status, it's something that people will read. It came really much sort of in the Industrial Revolution, when people were embracing sort of leisure time and were parading around showing their finery. Veblen, a sociologist writing at this time, saw how dress was an expression of a pecuniary culture. This essentially means that clothing within this context is a way of showing status, it's a way of showing wealth and occupation. Clothing can also be about storytelling, it can be about a narrative, it can enforce a narrative within a film, within a play, within an advert. And under this context, the important questions to ask are, how does the clothing convey meaning and help tell a story about the characters? So in what way do the shoulder pads in here of the working girl represent meaning and characterization? If we're looking at adverts, it's also about how do advertisers and designers decide upon the story they wish to tell. So, for costume designers, our inquiry into the language of clothing can take us into films, can take us into costume design, and how maybe in a historical context some of these delineations were more pronounced. It's also about storytelling, maybe about a particular era of a particular art movement. So Elsa Schiaparelli was heavily influenced by Surrealism and Dadaism, and here we can see this represented within her clothes. Similarly within advertising and branding, so a name, a logo comes to tell a story, comes to represent a key element of that logo. Another area which is of importance is the use of clothes within subcultures, and here we can look at the birth of the teenager and the growth of the subcultures, particularly within a sort of more urban setting. Key writers here are Hebdige, in his seminal text Subculture and the Meaning of Style. Also Muggleton and Polemus have also done some interesting studies on subcultures. One interesting study that I've come across is Ken Russell looking at the teddy girls. Quite often subcultures, we tend to look at our male counterparts, but there's some very interesting studies at female representations within subcultures. So maybe breaking out from traditional norms and styles of dress and adopting their own. Some of this study is linked into this idea of commodification, so where people and objects become commodities and we buy and we sell commodities. It's seen as linked to the growth of the consumer culture, so, and in particular to Americanization. The links we also have with clothing and representations within the media through music and television, and how they can conjure up a feel. So the hippie movements, the links to festivals and movements. Similarly with the growth of punk, so here we have some images from Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood from the 1976. So these images all help to tell a story. They all help to show both the change in clothing, these links maybe with clothing in the past and the future, and how they can represent issues and feelings from the time. But we'll also be looking at, as well as looking at visuals and looking at photographs, also be looking at quotes and key theory. This is a key quote that I like to use based on identity. And here Judith Williams, in her book Decoding Advertisements, talks about how instead of being identified by what they produce, people identify themselves through what they consume. And this makes this link between consumption and shopping and identity. Also look at some of the political issues and political identities. So the corset is a very good study in this, where we look at the controversy surrounding it, whether the corset was seen as an item of liberation or indeed an item of suppression. And for this, for us analysis, to make a deep analysis, we really need to read around the subject and do our research to look at the varying different viewpoints. So people such as Valerie Steele and David Kunsel, who have quite different opinions about the corset, can come into play. We can then see, okay, clothing linking to early forms of feminism. So the suffragette movements, who would be abandoning restrictive clothing in favour of more sporty, more liberating clothing. It was also something like the corset was, or the ditching of the corset was due to sort of health fears and also to further social and economic liberation. And it was also about new technologies of mechanisation. So as our production processes are mechanised, we see new forms. So what our study really entails is looking at how changes have come about, how changes in sort of style have been manifest themselves in society. As I say, quite often it's the in-between stages. It's those stages of how do we go from one state to another through this process called fashion. As I say, as well as looking at design work and looking at visual representations of clothing, we also need to read up on the subject. We also need to engage with theory. This is an important element of the course, and it's important that you read around the subject, be this text, be this academic text, or be this videos. You need to analyse the material that's put up on UniLearn and on Blackboard. I've uploaded many texts and guided reading and also links for you to look at. I would also suggest that you start compiling a bibliography, and this is essentially a list of all your resources, and these are the things that will help you carry you through your degree as sources of interest and of information for yourself. I would also start by pulling out quotes to help you contextualise your work. So quotes such as this, where we start reflecting on maybe their meaning. So this is a quote by Elizabeth Wilson, an important fashion writer, and here she sees how dress is seen as a mechanism through which the body is connected to the social world. And I like this. I like this this connection that we see where clothing has a social function. She argues here that clothing should be seen as a cultural phenomenon, as an aesthetic mechanism for the expression of ideas, desires, beliefs circulating in society. And I think she has a point here that actually, our clothing does express maybe who we are. It expresses what is being produced within society at that time, the desires of people. This is quite heavily linked to advertising, and this quote here by Subcultures talks about how to not be influenced by advertising would be to live outside of culture. No human being lives outside of culture. I think this makes this case for this link between advertising and our understanding of culture. A key writer from the 1970s, whose work I feel is still very relevant today, is John Berger, when he talks about ways of seeing. His seminal book on how we can analyse images and the different representations that we can see. And I would recommend that you either get the book or have a look at some of the clips on YouTube, because it's very, very illuminating stuff. He makes this link as well between advertising and how oil painting and advertising are very much linked. Although with oil paintings we would have seen a representation of what people owned, whereas with advertising it's very much about what people desire, what people do not own but would like to own. Another artist whose work I like and which I feel sums up some of these ideas about how clothing can be a language is Jinkx Bar, and here he used African fabrics but reinterprets them. He reinterprets this classic sort of English Victorian style of dress, but through through choosing different materials, and we've got motifs and prints, it reinterprets how we view those objects. So a classic case would be his reinterpretation of Gainsborough's picture, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And if we just flick through those again, we can see how he's represented the stance and the stature of the oil painting, but as I say, yes, reinterpreted it, and in the process also chopped off people's heads. I think what the key underlying message behind this was that here we have a quintessential English man and his wife sitting in their country estate. And I think Shonabari's argument is that actually much of this would have been built around slave labour, and yet they were not represented within any of these images. Another key theorist that I think holds some interest for us as designers, and particularly as people involved in clothing and meaning, is Roland Barthes, and he looks into the study of semiotics. When this first came out, it was really a science of sort of studying signs, and it came through from a linguistic approach. So it was looking at words and words and their meaning. But we can then take this to extend this to look at objects and artifacts as carrying meanings, as images, as practices carrying meaning. And therefore it's become highly used as a tool in the analysis of pieces of art and design. As I say, its roots are also in advertising and a way of extracting meaning. There are three key issues to semiotics. The first one is looking at denotation, and for this we are judging what something literally represents. We're then asking ourselves, what are the connotations, what are the associated feelings and meanings behind that image? And thirdly, which is a more difficult one to, I suppose, get your head round, is the idea of myth. And that is what we need to know before analysing the object and image. I think I'll just try to contextualise this through the image of a dog. So on a basic understanding, we have a denotation where we can describe it. We can describe it's a four-legged creature, has fur, different colours, and it's very different sort of physical attributes. Then we move on to connotations, and here we have all those associated meanings. So if we like dogs, this is likely to be a positive response, a positive connotation. If we don't, that's more likely to be a negative connotation. And those connotations would be based upon our own potentially conceived myth about the item that we're looking at, or a myth that's been built up throughout time, throughout culture, through tradition. And so here, if we have a positive connotation, it's based on the myth that dogs are basically friendly and that they are pets within our society, and they're not something to be feared. Then when we take these ideas onto clothing, we can start, okay, well, what does this garment denote? On a denotation, we can describe its physical attributions, but then when we look at the connotations of it, we can see how potentially this may change. So this is where we get a historical perspective. So something like a fur coat, which for its time would have been seen as something very sort of high status. Now, as we have a political edge that's been put on it, we can see that various different opinions towards this garment may well have changed. So here we have Shirley Manson advertising for PETA, the anti-fur organisation. So in conclusion, as I say, this is just a brief little introduction to some of the ideas surrounding this module. We can come with the argument that history can help us unravel the meaning of clothes. They can set them within an era and within a story. And it's the job of this module to help us unravel those meanings, to help us explore various different stories, different narratives, different eras, different designers, as a way of looking at these in-between spaces where we move from one style to another. A further conclusion is that clothes can speak to us, and that by analysing a range of contexts from films, adverts and garments themselves, we can start to read them. And this is all important as we start to read them and start to analyse them. we can start then putting our own theories and ideas onto them. And finally, it says by analysing the connotational context of clothing, so the messages and those maybe these changes in meaning through history, it says that we can access ideological meaning. So this means that we can start linking these to social, political and cultural messages. And by doing this, the argument goes that it can help us to understand our culture, it can help us to understand sort of our social life, and it can help us to look at how fashion and costume operates within this context. So I would suggest that for the next exercise is that you look through Blackboard and you familiarise yourself with the various different materials. As I say, there's many materials that I've put up there to guide you and help you in research. I would also suggest that you fill in a reflective journal entry. This is part of the requirement of the first term of the first term of the module. And this really is for you to record your thoughts and your feelings. So, have you been excited by the list of subjects we were going to be studying? Happy, scared? I'd also have a look through the handouts for the next lecture and read through the essay questions. Just as a reminder, if you please swipe in for each session. Thank you.